Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, it's my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Dr. Masahele. When he was employed as a scientist at SANBI, this is South African National Biodiversity Institute, he led the program that focused on assessment, monitoring, and research on the impact of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs as they're known. This morning, he will be talking about various aspects of genetically modified organism, this often contentious subject, especially among laymen like most of us. I know that he's probably one of the best people to enlighten us. He's a member of various prestigious societies. He was a chairman of the SANBI Career Ladder for Scientists at the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, and is of the subcommittee for the Advisory Committee on Genetically Modified Organisms. He has also attended and negotiated and participated, of course, also in various conventions on biological diversity. Dr. Masahele, welcome once again. We are looking forward to another brilliant lecture.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And thanks again for the opportunity. Today I'll be talking on genetically modified organisms. This was my main focus or role at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. Maybe just as a start, today's presentation will slightly be longer than the B1 that we did, just because when I started preparing the presentation, I realized that I needed to put some bit of global context on it, just before I get into the South African context, just so that you understand the whole picture of how GMOs are sort of governed and also a bit regulated, and what treaties are there in place internationally before we can bring it home. So I've structured the presentation into 4 parts. I'll just start with a general introduction on GMOs, giving a global context. Then right straight after that, we'll jump into GMOs. So you'll see I'll have section 1, 2, and 3. So when we start and we look at GMOs from a global context, it's always good to look at the definition. And this definition comes from a document which is called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is a treaty where a lot of countries have signed on. I'll speak to that shortly. But all it says is that genetically modified organisms are defined as organisms in which their genetic material, or what we normally refer to as DNA, has been altered in a way that it does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. So this means that a certain gene has to be taken somewhere to be put in this organism or to be inserted in this organism. So that's why they use the term does not occur naturally. So anything that occurs naturally through hybridization or so on cannot be labeled as a GMO or an LMO. And also in the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, we see that an LMO is any living organism that possesses a novel combination of genetic material, which is obtained using modern biotechnology. And this is just what I was referring to in terms of the insertion. It has to be a foreign gene. It has to come from somewhere to be inserted into the desired organism. So specifically, the LMO relates primarily to those GMOs that can replicate and potentially cause environmental harm. Hence, the word living is used. And whereas GMO could be a living organism or the product of that living organism. So in most cases, you will see in literature that LMO and GMO can be used interchangeably, whereas we are just used to GMOs because we see the final product as compared to the LMO, which could be a plant or an animal that is still living, and perhaps maybe that plant is not yet harvested, processed, or the meat of that particular animal is not yet consumed. And then just to further define it in terms of what other literature says, this is also very close to the Cartagena Protocol definition, and you will see that it also says that a genetically modified organism, or a GMO, is a plant, animal, or other organisms that has had a gene from other organisms transferred to it. And then the goal of that gene is to get any desired trait, which could be for resistance, drought, or to improve nutritional value. So this is all the intention of what a GMO could be used for. There must be some sort of desired benefit or outcome when it comes to the gene insertion of that into that particular organism. Then we look at the governance. Obviously, each and every country, or what they call parties, under the Convention of Biological Diversity, each country must have its own policies and regulations. But the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety serves as a bit of a basis for which countries can draw some guidance from this. And this was put in place in January 2000. And so far, there are about 173 signatories or parties that have signed this protocol out of the 193 countries globally. So it's got very good weight and representation. Most of you might be aware that similar with the climate change, Paris Agreement, and so on, this is one of those protocols that also governs the use of LMOs and GMOs across the globe. So these are just examples of the documents. All these documents are really available online through the CBD website if you just want to look at them. Very interesting. The language a little bit tricky, but not that difficult to follow. So the one on your left is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, the one that was published in 2000. And then we've got the Nagoya Protocol on liability redress. And now they've developed a new one on benefit sharing for natural resources, which really came from a lot of disputes where in most countries, the indigenous people felt that their resources have been used and they are not getting anything from those resources when multinational companies use all these products, either in pharmaceuticals or in agriculture. So there's one on benefit sharing, access and benefit sharing as well. So if we look at what the main application of genetic manipulation or modification are, we see that they are mostly used in research. It could be in agriculture, in medicine and others. And mostly in the food industry, most of the GMO foods are very controversial and highly contested. So the food industry is one of those. And then in the health and the pharmaceuticals, this is really one industry that has really got away with the use of GMOs. Like we have seen now with the COVID-19 vaccines, where the J&J vaccine is a GMO vaccine compared to the Pfizer, which is an iRNA. And obviously crop health improvement in agriculture against pests, diseases, and managing weeds. And animal health improvement, there's been a lot of GMO technology being used in animal health improvement. We have seen it in pigs. We have seen it in cattle, especially where milk is concerned, or people that are allergic and so on to certain substances in milk. Then environmental restoration, especially in rehabilitating areas where there was mining and other activities that might have harmed the environment. And one that is really becoming a little bit contested now and a little bit controversial is when it comes to biodiversity or conservation. Most of you will know that a lot of species have been extinct over the years and so on. And now most of those animals, there's currently a bit of research that is going on to revive or to resuscitate them using specimens that might have been stored in museums and so on. And in those research areas, the GMO technique that's been used, and also new techniques such as CRISPR, synthetic biology, and so on. And that has really sparked quite a lot of controversy in the area of science and research, where else a lot of people have also welcomed it in a sense that these animals can now be brought back onto the earth after their extinction in several years. Okay. Then we just look at a few examples of the first publicized GM products. Most of you might not know, but others might know that actually one of the first GM products or crop to be derived was a tomato, which was engineered for long shelf life. Funny enough, it never even made it into the market until like 2009 or so. I think Japan was the first country to approve it. But you know that your maize, cotton, soybean also came into the market way before this tomato, where else it was the first one to be researched on in the late 60s, I think 1969 to around 1973. And the famous one, which is the mice, looking at cancer tissues and cells and how they would behave in mice, and then how that could also enable us to understand how these cells can be manipulated into research, medicinal research towards treating and healing cancer in humans. Then we just look at the commercialized major crops. So this is what all these icons stand for all these different icons in the different countries. And you'll see really it's the Americas that are just leading in terms of the approvals, especially Brazil and Argentina. Obviously, the US is a different case altogether when it comes to GMOs, because that's where a lot of the multinational companies also come from. So a lot of these commercialization, they start there before going into other countries. And you'll see that Europe is quite clean. I mean, it's only Portugal and Spain. Most of you will know that in Europe, there's quite a lot of public awareness, NGOs and activists that are always up in arms around the use of GMOs, pesticides, and so on. Although they rely mostly on other countries to feed them, but they control on how the food that comes to them gets produced in those countries. And then just slightly looking into Africa, you'll see that Nigeria recently came on board, I think about 3 years ago. And Swaziland, of course, I think also about 2 years ago. Countries that have really disappeared here is Egypt and Burkina Faso. They used to also grow GMOs back in the days, I think until just early 2000s or so. And then they had a few issues and then those were a bit taken off the shelves. And then another country that you would not see here, it's Kenya and Uganda. They also have a lot of research that is currently going on GMOs. But currently in Africa, it's only about 6 countries that are growing GMOs. So this is what the picture looks like in terms of GM crops alone across the globe. Now I'll talk about this ISA website in the next slide, which is a very good website, very easy to access. When I first got interns or students, this is one of the websites that I really trained them to use quite strongly. Very informative, because on this website, you can get all the crops that are approved globally here on the left-hand side. In the different countries, you can get all their risk assessments. You can get all the approvals in terms of whether they are used for feed, food and processing, whether they have been rejected in any countries. And it's got a very nice drop-down menu that you can just select the country and the trade. And you can even see who the owner of that product is, whether it's Bayer, whether it's Monsanto, whether it's Corteva Sciences, you can pick that up. So I just included this screenshot because if I was to take you through the whole website, it takes quite a bit of a time. But when you have time, please do visit this website. It also just helps you to distinguish any myths and wrong information that you might come across on the internet in terms of what products are out there and what have they been approved in the different countries. So it's quite a very useful database or website to use. And then I've just included some of the other commercialized animals and products. Most of you might know about them, but they're just always interesting to see. The glowfish, the zebrafish, has made it quite strongly in the market, especially in the US, as a pet because it glows in the dark in your aquarium or in your fish tank at home. Then I spoke about cattle as well, where there's just been a lot of research on cattle. Like I said, mostly in the dairy industry because of people that are lactose intolerant and so on. But there's also other research that's coming on in terms of the texture of the beef or the steak and so on, the amount of fat in the meat and so on. So there's quite a lot going on there. And then there's also a lot going on pigs as well. Most of you might have read about some of the medicinal testing that's going on using pigs and so on. And then the salmon, very controversial as well when the first GM salmons were introduced in the market. They haven't made it to our shores yet. They are mostly in Canada and the US, but we know that South Africa has a big salmon market as well. So maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we won't be surprised to see it on our shelves as well. Then there was a lot that was going on sheep, especially when it comes to the amount of wool that can be produced on sheep. Then mosquitoes, another controversial one with the control of malaria and the Zika virus in the Americas as well. And now they've also moved to what they call gene drives, where they are looking to see if they can produce sterile male mosquitoes so that they can bring down the population of the offsprings that are coming off the females, or that the females, their eggs might not even get fertilized at all if the males that are released in high numbers are mostly sterile. Well, they've already done it in most instances. It's just the trials that are running now. So the mosquito one is also a good one to look at because it's currently picking up quite a lot of speed in the US and in Canada as well. They had trials in Guinea and in Burkina Faso as well, but those were pushed back quite strongly by most of the NGOs operating in those areas. I spoke about the beef one a little bit, so you can see the picture of the lab-grown burger. I know the US was one of the countries that was trialing these, and I think they have gone onto the market in the US and a few other countries. People seem to be, warming up to them. But yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Then obviously some of you might also know about the Chinese research on Tlou and Nana, which were the twins that were also developed in the lab. I think they were also taken to court, the scientists, and it's still a big issue. Because now I saw about sometime late last year that research was also taken up into CRISPR and gene editing and so on. So it has always remained controversial, and other people even labeling it as playing God, because it could not be allowed that you can engineer or genetically engineer babies from the lab for them to be considered human at all. Then obviously Dolly the sheep was also another famous one, where there was a direct clone of Dolly from the mother. Also another interesting story. It could take a while to talk about it, but these are just some of the examples that I thought I should bring forward, just to put it in context so that you realize that there is more out there in terms of what has been done on GMOs so far. So then I'll get into the South African context, where we look at the GMO activities, and all the GMO activities in South Africa are governed or regulated under the Genetically Modified Organisms Act of 1997. So under the Act, I'll just go back to the definition slightly, and you'll see that it aligns quite a lot with that one of the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. So it just simply says that genetically modified organisms means an organism whereby the genes or the genetic material of which has been modified in a way that does not occur naturally through mating or natural combination or both. So you can see this is right away almost a copy and paste from the Cartagena Protocol. And it's not surprising because South Africa is also a party to the convention or the CBD. And Barbara did say in the opening that I have over about 4 years been part of the department's negotiating and leading a delegation when it comes to the CBD participation each and every year. And if we look at what happens under the Act in terms of GMO activities, I'll not go into detail on each and every one, but just to let you know that there are several activities and these are regulated under the GMO Act. The first one being of importation of GMOs into the country, exportation of GMOs out of the country, contained use. This includes any research and development, whether it's at universities, whether it's at SANBI, whether it's at the Agricultural Research Council or the CSIR. They all have to go through this act as part of the risk assessment. And then obviously the introduction of GMOs into the environment. This talks about cultivation, where either maize, soybean, or cotton is now grown out up in the open in the environment. And then also there is a time extension that's dealt with when it comes to permits that have already been issued. And then commodity clearances when it comes to authorization of food, feed, and processing. And then commodity use as well comes again on the food and processing. And then registration of facilities that are involved with GMO activities. These are the labs in the country. The last time I checked, we only had 3 labs in the country that were having such a permit when it comes to the involvement with GMOs. And obviously the GMO status certification on export. So all this information is available on the Department of Agriculture's website. And if we just look at the GMO legislation in the country, so there are quite a number of legislative instruments that govern the use and regulation of GMOs in South Africa, but it's in bits and pieces. So this is where the chunk is under the GMO Act and its other amendments. Then we've got the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the Department of Health, Department of Science and Innovation, the Department of Trade and Industry, and all the different legislations that are there. In the Department of Health, in particular, it's the Foodstuff and the Cosmetic Acts. This is where all the labeling and issues with GMOs are. And then the Department of Science and Innovation, obviously they are tasked with ensuring that we keep abreast with other developments in other countries and we remain competitive in the market using current technology and innovation. So they've got the Bioeconomy Strategy, which I'll talk to in one of the slides coming up. And then obviously in the Department of Trade and Industry, we've got the Consumer Protection Act. This is where now if you've got any complaints and so on regarding GMOs or their trade in the country, that department will manage that. And then I spoke about the international ones. So this is where we fit with the CBD and the Codex with the Department of Health, and then the World Trade Organization there and the others on the Department of Trade and Industry. Okay, I spoke about the Bioeconomy Strategy, which is under the Department of Science and Innovation. So this is the Bioeconomy Strategy, which is really a document that says, why is South Africa for the technology? Why has South Africa decided to take this route of adopting the technology and using it in every department? So they've got about 4 pillars, which this document talks about. And in agriculture, very straightforward. It's about food security, if you look at managing crops. Then food, it's also about food security, but also looking at improving nutritional value and also just the quality of the food that comes onto the table. Then in the health sector, the vaccines, the insulin for people that have diabetes. And we've got about proteins and other pharmaceuticals as well. And then in the environment, like I said, a lot of the countries have started looking at the technology in terms of rehabilitating the environment, especially in those areas where mining have left a bit of a devastating trail after many years of mining. So there's a bit of rehabilitation that is going on whereby it is being used. Okay, then when we look at South Africa's permit application system, I won't spend a lot of time on this one because it's just to show you that there is a process that gets followed when an application is submitted by a particular person or a particular company and it seeks to obtain a permit to either do research on GMOs, to bring them into the country for commodity clearance, food and feed processing, or for exportation, or even for trials and so on. So the GMO application will be received by the registrar's office. Ideally, a public notice must be issued like they would do with environmental impact assessments for mines and so on. And it must be in a newspaper, it must be on radio and so on, so that it can allow for public participation. And then Barbara also mentioned in her opening and introduction that I sit on the advisory committee. I actually sit on the subcommittee, which is part of this advisory committee, where we will also do our own risk assessments, looking at the application itself, and the public is also allowed to submit their views on the application. Mostly I've seen a lot of NGOs submitting as compared to individuals, but there are some individual submission that comes through. And then on this, what they call the Executive Council, there are a lot of other departments that are represented there, which include forestry, fisheries, there's trade and industry, there's also labor and water and sanitation as well. So this whole process of reviewing the application can take anything around 30 to 60 days, depending on the complexity of the application. Then South Africa also follows what they call a three-tiered approach risk analysis process. So this is the process whereby the application that has been received will be scrutinized in more detail by the committee, the subcommittee, and also the Executive Council. So I also won't go into detail about this, but just to show you that there are different steps which will go at looking at what are our protection goals in the country when it comes to the environment, human health, and so on. And then that will lead us to identifying the problem of any risks or harms or pathways to harm that might be out there when it comes to the GMO that is in question. And one thing to keep in mind is that when these risk assessments are done, there is nothing such as zero risk. There is always risk to anything or any activity that is being done. What we look at is what is the level of risk and is it within an acceptable level or a manageable level. And this is where we now talk about risk characterization, which looks at the likelihood of that risk and what are the consequences. So the likelihood is, can it happen? Will it happen? Might it happen? If it happens, at what scale? And what will be the outcomes, the damage caused either to human health or to the environment? Then if that's the case, what are the proposed mitigation or risk measures that have been put in place? This is where you now look at the risk management plans, the containment plans, if it's material that will be destroyed after it's used, have everything been taken into consideration to make sure that all that material can be destroyed without it getting back into the environment and contaminating the environment and so on. Then we look at that decision based on all these steps. And before then, whether it's approved or rejected, it can be put to say this must be monitored, this must be reported on several occasions, so many times a year, and so on. And all these steps, they're always followed by a risk communication strategy with the applicant that is being involved, with the EC, the committees, and also the registrar's office. So that's why I said the process can take about 30 to 60 days because there can be a lot of back and forths, even requesting additional information. So this is what it looks like for the risk analysis that has been followed by South Africa, and it's not unique to South Africa. The European Food Safety Authority is one of those authorities that also follow this three-tiered approach, and it's been quite a robust approach over the years, and it's constantly revised from year to year. As you will see on this slide, we've got this environmental risk assessment framework that we started revising in 2019. I think it's almost at its completion phase now. And what its purpose really is to provide a detailed guidance on the environmental risk analysis process. And it's not prescriptive. While it does, it provides guidance, so it's got some flexibilities. The only downfall when this one came out in 2005 was that it was only prescriptive for plants or GM crops. And we have realized over the years that there are new products that are coming into the market. Like I spoke about GM salmon, that it's one of those that we might anticipate on the market in the near future. So we need to start preparing for those. So in these areas, you'll see that some focus areas on it are mostly on the principles and the tiered approach of the era, the quality of the data that's required, and also just some of the provisions around the management plans. So I'm sure once this document is approved, there'll probably be a bit of a media release also on by the department that would be done, because it's quite a comprehensive document that has been useful to this process for over 15 years. So now I'll get into section 3. We'll just get into the status and the trends of GMOs in the country. I'll try and go a little bit slow here, because this is where most of you might also be interested quite strongly. And this is obviously one of the crux of our presentation today. So all this data that I'm presenting was mostly compiled using 2021 and before data, because we have also used a lot of this information for the report that will be released later this year by the minister, the one that I said I'm still contracted to Sunby in finishing towards the end of June. So if we look at this, we've got a total of 64 general releases. By general releases, we are talking about approvals that are mostly for releases into the environment. So this is mostly for cultivation, food, and feed. And these are for importation and exportation, commercial planting, and also for use of food and feed processing. And then we talk about the total number of events. And in this case, the events are just like your cultivars. Most of you that might be interested in gardening and so on, you'll know that different plants have different cultivars and so on. So when we look at maize, which has the most, 42, not surprising because maize is still our staple food or crop in the country. Then we've got about poultry vaccines, we've got about 13. But some of them, when we looked at them, we realized that a lot were replicas. So for poultry vaccine, we can just put it around 5 with a lot of replicas that gets it to about 13. And then we've got cotton, looking at 6. And then vaccines as well, which we couldn't tell whether they were still poultry vaccines or if there were any other vaccines that were used. But we can safely say that these were not the COVID-19 vaccines, because most of you would know that the COVID vaccines got an exemption from the risk assessment process because they were regulated under the Risk Disaster Act or Management Act, as we know that the president lifted this about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. So the COVID-19 vaccines were regulated slightly different. And then we have the soybean, which only has 1. Then if we look at the types of commercial traits that we have, in maize, we've got what we call single or stacked traits. And the IR stands for insect resistance. Then we've got the HT, which is herbicide tolerant, DT, which is the drought tolerance, and then we've got the antibiotic resistance as well. For the poultry vaccines, we couldn't get any specifications on those. And then for the cotton, we also have the insect resistance and the herbicide tolerant. And then, like I said, for those vaccines, we couldn't get what they were called. These are these last ones here, where they are not specified. And then soybean, we know that for the longest time, we've had the herbicide tolerant one, which is the one that is mostly used. So this is a general overview of what it's looking like in terms of approvals in the country for general releases. And like I said, general releases are those that are out there in the environment in terms of planting, cultivation, use for processing in terms of food and feed. Then I'll just take you slightly to a few of the GM crops. So in South Africa, we only have 3 GM crops that have been approved for general release. I'll go to the trials in the next slide. For the general release, we only have cotton, maize, and soybean. And we know by now that each and every year, we've got an area of about 2.7 million hectares where these 3 crops are planted. It fluctuates, so that's why we put it about 2.7. But I remember in the years where we had like severe droughts, at some point we were down to about 2.3 or 2.4 million hectares. And the leading crop is always maize, then soybean, then cotton. And if you look at these bars, here what we have shown is the difference between the genetically modified and the conventional. So here you can see that almost 90%, last year it was over 95% of our maize is genetically modified. and I'm sure you would have seen this in a lot of media articles like newspapers and so on, only 10% is conventional. Then when we look at cotton, 100% of our cotton in the country is genetically modified. When we look at soybean, 95% of soybean in the country is genetically modified. We still can't find this 5% of conventional where it is. We had a student, Paul Janse van Rensbeck, who worked on soybean in around 2019, 2020. And this project was looking at insect diversities in the soybean fields. And we struggled so much to find this 5%, which would have enabled us to compare the diversity between GM and non-GM crops. So the department still maintains it at 5%, but we really don't know which farmers are growing this 5% of conventional soybean. Then we look at the trials. So the trials refer to any products that are under contained or fenced or well-managed secure facilities, even your greenhouses or your glass houses. So this is what we are looking at. So we still have a lot of trials that are going on maize, cotton, and soybean, obviously for new improved traits in these. And then what we have seen in the past few years, we have had trials on GM sugarcane. So these are all GM. We have had trials on GM sugarcane, on GM potato, GM canola, GM cassava, GM wheat, grapevines. Stellenbosch University is playing quite a big role on the grapevines, and also the groundnuts, a few of those. And if we look at what traits are mostly now being trialed on all these crops, we've got quite a lot. I spoke about these HTs, so I won't talk about them now. But then we've got oil and fatty acids that are coming on board, starch enhanced, especially in sugarcane. And then we've got pollen reduced also a bit in sugarcane. And then we've got some microbial activities. And then the big one that is now associated with climate change is the increased yield. As you know, some areas are experiencing severe drought or severe heat waves from time to time. So there's a lot of crop failures. So there are a lot of crops that are geared towards increasing yield. And then sucrose content as well. And then also increased cellulose. Mostly all of these and alternative sugar starches are in the sugar cane, because sugar cane, unlike just the processing of the sugar, the excess material is also used for other things as well. So that's why they are looking at those aspects. So like I said, a lot of this data is a year or 2 years from where we are now, because it was compiled mostly when we were still focused on the. Then we look at section 4, whereby we look at the risks, concerns, and benefits associated with GMOs. And I always speak about this with a bit of caution, because what is a risk to your neighbor might not be a risk to you. What is a concern to one of your family members might not be a concern to you. What is of benefit to me might not be of benefit to you, even if we are looking at the same thing. So it's just helpful to keep a bit of an open mind when we talk about these risks, concerns, and benefits as well. So mostly when we look at these risks and benefits, we look at the human health, biodiversity, and the environment, obviously some bit of benefits, and it's always good to look at the challenges that we face now and what the future might hold for us. So a bit of guidance when dealing with GMOs, concerns, impacts, and risk. We firstly have to look at that each and every GMO activity is different. When you look at maize and you look at the risks associated with maize, they might not be the same risk that you would look at when you look at cotton, for example. Then the event or the trait. If you're looking at something that is what most of you might call Roundup ready, which is mostly like a herbicide tolerant, a trait, it will not be the same as an insertion that only looks at biofortification or increasing nutrition quality in that particular product. Then we look at the type of use. A product that is going to be used for animal feed cannot be looked at the same as a product that maybe is going to be used maybe just for general research, maybe as a byproduct or so. Then also we have to look at the receiving environment. Something that is going to be introduced in the Klein Karoo somewhere cannot be looked the same way as something that is going to be released somewhere in St. Lucia or in a very sensitive environment at the bottom of the Drakensberg mountain. Because each and every environment is different with its own microclimates and environmental conditions. And when we look at the impacts, we look at both the positive and the negative. Most of us, when we talk about impacts, we just think negative, but they can be positive impacts as well. So we need to look at those. And then we look at the risk anticipated. The risk anticipated can be looked at before the introduction or the release, and even after the introduction or the release. Because what might have been anticipated before the release might change once the product or the plant or the animal is now in the environment and it's interacting with it. And you might pick up a few things that were not anticipated in terms of the interaction or the behavior. Then we look at the health concerns when it comes to GMOs. A lot of them, they come on toxicity. A lot of people will say, if I consume GMOs or GM products and so on, they will affect my health, they will alter my system and so on. And that is linked to the second one, which talks about allergenicity, where people might be allergic to certain products. As we know, we've got lots of issues with labeling of GMOs or GMO products. In South Africa, it's still a big issue. Even in some of the American states, it's still the case. I think Europe is really one of those areas where they've really gotten quite a good grip of labeling GMOs. Then we look at specific compounds of nutritional or toxic properties, where it's a big concern when it comes to GMOs. Then the stability of the inserted genes. Some people say, no, maybe if I eat GMOs, once those genes are in my body, they can alter my DNA makeup or material. So that is also one of the areas that has got a lot of research. Then in nutritional effect associated with GMOs, the common question there is whether GM foods have the same value or nutrition as the organic counterparts. You know, whether they are better in taste, better in texture, and so on. And research has really shown that there's very little difference. And in some areas, you do get the GMOs. In some instances, the foodstuffs can even be better than your own GMO counterparts. The nutrition quality can be improved through the use of the technology. Then you've got any unintended effects, which might result from the gene insertion. This is in terms of whether people maybe can develop any side effects or any new diseases after the ingestion or the use of GMO products. Then we've got other direct and indirect effects from GMO products. And this can be anything that is very specific to specific people. As you know, that we all have different genetic makeups. So what treats you good might not treat me the same as well, even if we consume the same products prepared in the same way. So these are some of the general concerns. And when we come to biodiversity and the environment, the common one being that GMO can escape. It can affect our waterways, our wild populations, and also how it can affect what we normally call the non-target organisms. In this area, mostly, you will see that a lot of studies have focused mostly on honeybees and monarch butterflies and how they've been affected by the cultivation or the planting of GMO crops. And then also the stability of the gene, which talks to the first one, where most people will say, but my neighbor is planting a GM crop, I'm doing conventional, there's a risk of contamination and this affects my market and my product. Then we've also seen in many instances where there is a direct link or an indirect link as well when it comes to the loss of biodiversity that occurs due to GMOs. A common one around here is whereby maybe new land will be cleared to plant GM crops in certain areas. And this has been also another contested area. The increase in use of chemicals in agriculture, most of you will be very familiar with the use of glyphosate or what they call Roundup, because the GM crops that are Roundup ready or herbicide tolerant are mostly using Roundup. There are new ones that are coming on the block that are using 2,4-D and the others, but really Roundup was one of the major chemicals that came with GM crops. And over and over and over, it has been shown that there has been a huge increase in the use of glyphosate, and this ends up in water courses. There are many law cases or lawsuits in the US and in Europe around cancer causing ingredients or active ingredients within glyphosate. And you would know that Monsanto has been sued quite a lot of times when it comes to this. So there is that link that has been shown by studies that there can be an increase when it comes to chemical use in agriculture, when it comes to GMOs. And then we slightly look at the benefits. I won't spend a lot of time here. I'll just make major highlights. This again comes from the ISA database. Brooks and Barfoot, they do a lot of studies every 2 years on this to look at what the benefits are on GMOs globally. So you'll see that it's associated with increasing crop productivity. I spoke about yield better in the earlier stages when I spoke on one slide. And then they are also talking about providing a better environment, which some people argue against. Some people say, no, the use of GMOs increases herbicide use, such as glyphosate. And then the others say, but then with the BT ones, or the ones that are insect resistant to control insects and so on, you no longer use a lot of insecticides there. So you are saving because of GMOs. Then conserving biodiversity, I also spoke about this one earlier. Then there is quite a few studies that talk about reducing CO2 emissions, because in most cases, when you use GMO crops, you use non-till agriculture. So you save on your tractor trips around your farm in terms of cultivation and so. Then, yeah, there's always this controversial one on helping alleviating poverty and hunger, whereby they talk on improving nutrition, creating jobs, and also bringing income to the smallholder farmers as well. Like I said, this is one of those controversial ones because it differs from one country to the other. Then we look at if GMOs can address the future challenges, a very common question across lots of platforms. I took this from the World Economic Forum survey of 2018 and 2019. They have a new one of 2021, but it doesn't have this detailed map. I just want you to focus only on the green and mostly the red, which are the environmental risks and also the societal risks, because this is where a lot of literature always talks about GMOs being the potential saviors or uses in those areas. So if you look at something like extreme weather events, I spoke about droughts and high heat in certain areas, which mostly lead to crop failures. So for example, people will say, but then you can have GMOs that are engineered to stand up against those drought areas. So your drought tolerant crops, your heat tolerant crops, your salt tolerant crops. Then you've got like man-made disasters whereby the technology can be used for remediation in some of those areas. The same applies to climate change related issues and mitigation, the food crisis that we see, the water issues that we have seen over the time, and also the spread of infectious diseases, where now they are saying the use of technology in pharmaceuticals has been shown to be worth it in terms of the diseases that have been treated over time. So these are just some of the examples that one can pick out. But like I said, it will differ from one country to the other in terms of their priorities. And like I said as well, what might be of benefit to me or what I feel they can address might not be the same to the next person sitting next to me. So what can we expect from GMOs in the coming future? Like I said, our world continues to change, so are the challenges. So as the challenges change, as humans, we always make means to acclimatize or to work around ways that will make us live better or adjust better to those conditions. Each country has its own circumstances and priorities, and also the needs versus the wants, from job creation to food security to stability in terms of maybe warfare and others. So the resources will always be channeled differently, depending what the needs and the priorities are of those countries. But as we know, for now, that there's quite a strong challenge to deal with climate change related issues as they affect a lot of the food security challenges that we face, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. It wouldn't be surprising to see more and more products coming from GMOs to try and address these. They are not the only ones. Some might look at quick fixes or even the technology or other options to close the gap in there. And then over the years, we have also seen a huge shift from just the use of GMOs. So I won't spend a lot of time on these because they can be a bit complex as well. So we mostly just refer to this as new breeding technologies, or what they call NBTs. And most of you might have heard me speaking about CRISPR, synthetic biology, RNAi, and so on. So these are all some of the technologies that are coming into play. Others are already in use. But what is happening now is that the GM technology is slowly being seen as a standard or an old technology. So now you have technologies like gene editing that is also now being used quite a lot in medicine. Some of you might have read about a month or 2 months ago about a patient who received a pig heart in the US. Well, unfortunately, he died after 2 or 3 weeks, I think. But all that process was done through one of the gene editing processes, including CRISPR-Cas9. But like I said, there's quite a lot that is now coming. So maybe in the next 10 years, we won't even be talking about the GMO technology anymore. We'll just be talking about CRISPR. We'll be talking about synthetic biology. We'll be talking about things like just the RNAi, which is used a lot in medicine as well. We'll be talking about crafting and so on. And all these applications are going into conventional crops and livestock, the old GM crops, the rDNA medicines, gene therapy, biofarming, and also gene drives that I spoke about when I touched on mosquitoes. So there's quite a change that is coming. So we might not even talk about the GM technology anymore in about 10 or 15 years to come. I've got the last section just to highlight briefly some of the work that I was involved in at SANBI, just as a KTC as well, because this is where I've done my work. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I'll just run through about 4 projects at very high level in terms of some of the projects that we have done since I was involved there since 2014. So SANBI's work comes from the mandate under the Nimba Act, which is the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act of 2004. It's also currently under review. And what it says is just that SANBI must monitor and report regularly to the minister on the impacts of any genetically modified organisms that have been released into the environment. And this includes all categories of GMOs. So SANBI had a few major reports before I even arrived. This was one of the reports that they produced in 2010 with the collaboration with the Norwegian government. And it was focused on MON 810, which was one of the first GM maize to be approved for general release in South Africa. I won't go into detail into what the outcomes of that was, but this report is also available on the SANBI website as well. But it was quite an interesting report to look at. And this was one of my first projects that I commissioned in the Eastern Cape, whereby we were looking at 2 GM maize cultivars and how the farmers, the small scale farmers, are using herbicides in these fields to control weeds. And you can see how bad some of the weeds looked in these fields compared to just a little bit of maize there. And these were some of the combinations of herbicides that they use. Like I said, Roundup or glyphosate is always in the mix, because this is what the Roundup ready crops were literally engineered to do. So we had 2 students that were working on this project, and it concluded in 2019. They were registered at the Northwest University, and also their thesis is very much available online as well. Then we had a project that we ran in 2019 with smallholder farmers as well in Gauteng. Again, we were looking at herbicide use in these 3 cultivars of soybean. Like I said, all GM as well. And we were looking at harness as a pre-emergence herbicide. And then we were looking at use of Roundup and its impact on the environment used as a post-emergence. Pre-emergence just means that the herbicide is sprayed before the crop emerges from the soil, about 3 or 4 days after planting. And then post-emergence is after the crop has come out, about 5 to 6 weeks. And we look at the differences in terms of how weeds are controlled in that area. Then we also had another project that was done by also one of the students from Paul that I spoke about, and he was looking at arthropod diversity in GM soybean in a few provinces, Free State, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and Mpumalanga. He also finished as well, so his thesis is also available. This was also another interesting project just to see how much insect diversity is in these GM crops when they are still using herbicides and insecticides in some of the instances. And then the report that I spoke about, that's going to be released sometime this year. I hope it will be before August. So this will be the first report since South Africa introduced GM crops in the last 23 to 24 years to look at holistically what are the impacts, if there have been any impacts on biodiversity emanating or arising from the use of the GM crops, or if there have been any benefits. So it took us about 3 years to put this report together, and we are finally at the last hurdle or the last stages. And I hope maybe by July or August, it will be ready for the public. And this will probably be maybe my last contribution to the SANBI work on GMOs. This is my last slide. Thank you very much. Barbara, that concludes my talk, and then I'm free to take any questions.
Yes, I have a question. I'm overwhelmed by the thoroughness of research, by all the laws and controls that have been put into place. But I would like to know, what is the real risk to people in South Africa? If you can give us a percentage of the people who are affected, or whether you think it's negligible.
So far, I think it's very negligible, especially when it comes to crops, because I'll talk specifically about crops because that's where I've done a lot of my work. And I didn't know much what is happening in the health sector and so on. But I would imagine that if in the crops we've managed to have that high level of oversight, in medicine it's even stricter than what we do in crops. One area that still worries me and concerns me very deeply it's the use of pesticides, which has not really been looked at in the country at all. Just from the top of my head, I think there are only 3 research papers that I've seen in the country that have really looked at what are the impacts of pesticides when they are used in agriculture, especially around GM crops, if they've got any leaching into our waterways or water ecosystems, what they do to the aquatic life, and also for communities that are staying next to where these streams flow. Because we'll know that a lot of our informal settlements are just on the verge of some of these streams and rivers. And they use that water for drinking, for washing, and so on. And we really don't know what that is doing to them. So that is still one of my big areas of concerns where I feel that as a country, we haven't invested much. But in terms of us cultivating the crops, processing them, and so on, I think we still have a very good oversight system there and a bit of accountability. There have been rejections of some of the applications because the assessment committee and so on felt that certain measures, mitigation measures were not met, certain data was not satisfactory, there were no economic benefits that would have seemed to have brought any change into the South African market.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes. What happened to Tlou and Lada?
It's very interesting. When you have time, just go onto the internet, even YouTube and just your normal Google. The Chinese scientist, I think I know one of them was given a jail term. I don't know if he's serving it already, but there are a lot of issues around the ethics of that research. So the research is still ongoing, and I think they've got now also a Canadian research team that's on board. It is still ongoing, and it's terrifying to say the least. So yeah, maybe I think when you have time, just glance over it and you'll see just the ethical concerns and controversies that have been brought by Tlou and Nana. Over 20 years that they've been busy with the research now.
Yes. What do you say about people who refuse vaccinations, especially the Johnson & Johnson vaccinations?
I don't want to put my head on the block, but look, I think every person should be given a chance to evaluate the risks versus the benefits. And no one should be forced to take a vaccine if they feel that it's not worth it for them or they won't benefit from it in any way. But people must just be well informed. Like, for example, people never knew the differences between Pfizer and J&J, how they are made and so on. You know, it was only just talking through a few people and a few radio stations that really covered it. And that's why people must have been given an option to say, this is a GM vaccine, this is an RNA vaccine, and then they can make an informed decision. But unfortunately, some of that information never filtered down to most of our people or the society at large.
Is there any legislation to ensure that products are labeled that one buys from in the shops, to ensure that we don't buy GMO manufactured or produced products?
100%. Through our Food and Cosmetics Act, it's there under the Department of Health. The Crop Protection Act is also quite strongly on that. So the legislation is there. We just have very, let me use the word naughty. We've got naughty manufacturers out there. We've got a lot of manufacturers that want to cut corners, increase profits, and they don't label. And that is against the law. The only problem that has come with GMOs is what they call the threshold level. For example, in South Africa, when a GM product contains, I think it's less than 0.05% of certain ingredients, then it's exempted from labeling. That's why you'll see some products will say may contain, remnants of 1, 2, and 3. But once it's over a certain threshold, then it must be labeled. I think one product, I don't mean to favor, but I think one company that has managed to do this well is the Robertson Spices. They are the one products that I've seen in many years. They've always put whether it's GMO contained or non-GMO. And then over time, a bit of the cereals have also come on board because now people were aware that 95% of the maize in South Africa is GM, and also wheat, because we import a lot of we grow quite a substantial amount of wheat in the country, but a lot of what goes into our food and feed processing is imported wheat. And in the US, and I think in a few other countries where they farm wheat, it's mostly GM there. So it's meant to be labeled as well when it comes into the country. So labeling is mandatory, it's not negotiable, but we just have people that cut corners because they want to maximize certain things.
I want to ask you a question, if I may. You know, there's a trend amongst farmers to increase the size of the land because of the economy of scale. But now, do GMO products make it easier for small-scale farmers to produce their crops economically?
From a lot of the studies that have been done by the two guys, Brooks and Barfoot, so they are starting to show, and I think there's quite a lot of data from Argentina and Brazil and a little bit of the US as well. They are showing that GM crops focus on high yield and so on. They can give you more on the same amount of land. If you've got 1 hectare and you were harvesting maybe, let's say for argument's sake, 30 tons per hectare, it's now starting to be shown that you can even double that yield just by moving over to maybe a certain type of a GM crop. But again, one thing that you can't control or you don't have control of is climatic conditions. Even if you have that GM crop and so on, but if your rain is still not well, your soil is not managed well, your soil microorganisms are not at the level where they're supposed to be and so on, you might still struggle. But now what we are seeing is that there is more and more advocacy and a bit of data coming in to show that you can get a bit of an upper yield still using the same amount of land that you have.
You also talked about drought-resistant crops, so a combination of high yields and drought resistance. Surely that must also improve the condition of small farmers.
Absolutely. The difficulty is getting those crops onto the market. Maybe you might not know, but UCT has been drought-tolerant crop research, I think, since the days of Professor Jennifer Thompson, and she has now retired. I think Pioneer was one of the first companies to fund them for that research in the early 2000s, if not the late 90s. And it is just difficult. They just haven't won with some of the products that have come out there. But certainly drought resistance. Now there are also crops that have heat resistance. And I know there are a lot of rice cultivars, especially for the Asian countries, that are looking at flood resistance as well, because they've been struggling with their monsoon seasons and so on, and they lose quite a lot of crops. They're starting to see a combination of 4 to 5 gene particular crop, certain things.
Well, thank you very much. And we can go on talking about this topic for forever, I think. And I think many people will continue talking about it. You've made certain things very clear to me. I can see that you've done a lot of research. I can see that you know a lot about the topic. And I want to congratulate you on this brilliant talk. It was very knowledgeable. It was informative. And I think everybody enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much. And I hope that we will see you again in the future